India thought it could stay neutral. Then Iran changed everything. On April 18, 2026, two Indian oil tankers entered one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. Then Iranian gunboats opened fire. The ships turned around immediately. India said nothing. 4 days later, Iran seized another Indian vessel. And in that moment, India realized something dangerous. Its relationship with Iran may no longer protect it. Half of India's crude oil flows through that 21-mile gap of water. When Iran closed it, India didn't just lose access to cheap energy. India lost the ability to feed its population. Nobody's talking about that second part. They're focused on oil prices, inflation, fiscal deficits. All of that matters. But the crisis that's actually unfolding is happening in the fertilizer supply chain. And if it continues, 800 million people who depend on subsidized food programs are going to find out what happens when a distant war collapses the system keeping them alive. India imports over 9 million tons of urea every year. The Middle East supplies half of it. Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. When shipments from Qatar get disrupted because Iranian threats make the strait impassable, domestic production falters. India's urea plants run on natural gas. Qatar is the largest supplier of liquefied natural gas to India. No LNG means no domestic fertilizer production either. It's not one problem. It's two simultaneous failures hitting the same critical supply chain. Before the war, urea cost under $425 per ton on global markets. It's now above $600. Diammonium phosphate, where Saudi Arabia alone accounts for over 40% of India's imports, has spiked similarly. Potash, which India is almost entirely dependent on foreign sources for, is climbing in price because global supplies are tightening and India is now competing with wealthier nations who can outbid it. A government source admitted that if the war drags on, things could get tight. That's diplomatic language, for we don't have a solution. Here's the math nobody wants to state plainly. India's strategic petroleum reserves hold enough oil for 20 to 25 days, 3 weeks. That's the buffer between normal operations and economic collapse. But petroleum reserves don't grow food. Fertilizer does. And India doesn't stockpile fertilizer the way it stockpiles oil. The fertilizer that arrives this month gets distributed to farmers within weeks. There's no strategic reserve, no backup plan. The supply chain assumes the strait stays open. It didn't. On March 9th, India invoked the Essential Commodities Act to ration gas distribution. LPG cylinder prices increased by 60 rupees. That's less than $1. In a country where millions live on $2 a day, 60 rupees is the difference between cooking meals and extending the life of a gas cylinder by simply not using it. Reports from major cities confirm what the data suggests. People are skipping cooked meals. Migrant workers are leaving urban centers because the cost of living just breached the ceiling of what they can afford. That's not a future problem. That's April 2026. Now add the diaspora variable. 9 million Indian workers live in the Gulf. They send home $51 billion annually in remittances. That's nearly equal to India's entire trade surplus with the United States. Those workers aren't just an economic asset. They're a structural pillar of India's balance of payments. Iranian strikes on critical infrastructure across the Gulf have already triggered the departure of high-income Western expatriates. Construction projects are stalling. Hospitality sectors are shedding jobs. Retail demand is collapsing. The Indians working in those sectors aren't being targeted directly. They're being displaced by an economy that's contracting under the weight of a war they have no part in. If even 10% of that diaspora needs evacuation, that's 900,000 people. India holds the Guinness World Record for the largest civilian airlift. Kuwait, 1990. 170,000 people in 63 days. This would be 5 times that scale. And unlike Kuwait, where airspace was contested but navigable, the current crisis has entire regions with closed airspace and sea routes under active interdiction. India has pulled off evacuations before. Yemen, Sudan, Libya. But none of those approach the logistical nightmare of extracting 1 million people from a region where every exit is either blocked or burning. Then there's the diplomatic humiliation nobody in New Delhi wants to acknowledge. Pakistan is mediating between Iran and the United States, not India. Pakistan, the same country India has spent 2 decades trying to isolate on the world stage. The same country that India just fought in Operation Sindoor less than a year ago. Pakistan, alongside Egypt and Turkey, has emerged as Washington's preferred back channel to Tehran. India, which maintains working ties with both sides, which hosted Iranian warships for naval reviews, which operates a strategic port inside Iran at Chabahar, has been shut out of the diplomatic process entirely. For a government that has staked its reputation on projecting India as the indispensable voice of the global South, this is worse than a policy failure. It's a collapse of the entire narrative. Prime Minister Modi elevated ties with Israel to a special strategic partnership just days before the war began. That alignment with the US and Israeli camp was supposed to buy India leverage. Instead, it bought India silence. When the Iranian frigate Iris Dina was sunk by a US submarine, India's response was muted. Not because New Delhi approved, because New Delhi had no options. Condemning the strike alienates Washington. Staying silent alienates Tehran. India chose silence and lost credibility with both. Pakistan didn't have that problem. Islamabad condemned the strikes publicly, maintained its relationships in the Gulf, and positioned itself as the neutral party both sides could talk to. The result is that Pakistan is inside the room where ceasefire terms are being discussed. India is watching from the outside. There's a longer-term threat that hasn't materialized yet but will. Weapons proliferation. If Iran's government collapses into civil war, different factions will raid military depots. The same thing happened in Libya in 2011. Looted weapons didn't just fuel Libya's internal conflict. They flowed across borders into Mali, Niger, and Nigeria, destabilizing an entire region. India won't face the same type of instability that Africa did, but it won't be immune to the weapons problem either. Shoulder-fired missiles, anti-tank guided munitions, explosives, all of it could end up in the hands of groups operating along India's borders. That's not speculation. That's what happens every time a heavily armed state loses control of its arsenals. And then there's Chabahar. India spent years building a port in southeastern Iran designed to give it direct access to Afghanistan and Central Asia without touching Pakistan. It was India's answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The US gave India a sanctions waiver to keep operating there because even Washington recognized the strategic value. That waiver expired. India is now divesting its stake in the port, transferring control to an Iranian entity. The payout was completed before sanctions were reimposed. India's entire financial commitment, roughly $120 million, has been liquidated. The port India built to bypass Pakistan is now effectively controlled by Iran. And if Tehran decides to lease it to China as part of a broader economic arrangement, India will have funded the infrastructure for its own encirclement. China is waiting for exactly that opportunity. Gwadar Port in Pakistan is already operational. If Chabahar falls into China's orbit, Beijing will control both sides of the Arabian Sea. The strategic bridge to Eurasia that India spent a decade constructing will become another node in China's network. India's position right now can be summarized in one sentence. It is the only country in the world that Iran fired on, that Iran also apologized to, that still has an Iranian warship sheltered in its own port, and that cannot influence the diplomatic process determining how this war ends. That's not leverage. That's irrelevance disguised as neutrality. Foreign portfolio investors have already figured this out. $19 billion exited Indian markets in the first quarter of 2026. Standard Chartered projects. India's fiscal deficit will expand beyond 5% of GDP, breaching the target by nearly a full percentage point. Oil prices spiking past $100 a barrel add $75 to $100 billion to India's annual import bill. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between manageable inflation and a currency crisis. India's strategic autonomy, the doctrine it has spent 2 decades refining, only works when all parties need India for something. Iran needed India's oil money and port access. Israel needed India's defense market. America needed India as a counterweight to China. Russia needed India when Europe said no. That balance held as long as the conflict stayed cold. The Iran war turned it hot, and in a hot conflict, neutrality becomes a liability. You can't mediate when both sides have already decided you're compromised. You can't protect your citizens when the country they live in is under attack, and you've aligned with the attackers. You can't secure your energy supply when half of it flows through a choke point controlled by a country that just fired on your ships. India built an entire foreign policy framework around the idea that it could maintain relationships with everyone and commitments to no one. February 28, 2026, when US and Israeli forces launched Operation Epic Fury, that framework didn't just crack, it shattered. And India is still standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out which pieces can be salvaged and which ones are gone for good. The crisis India faces isn't abstract, it's visceral. People are living it right now. March 9, 2026, the Indian government invoked the Essential Commodities Act to ration cooking gas. LPG cylinder prices jumped 60 rupees overnight. That's less than $1. But when you're extending the life of a single cylinder by skipping meals, not cooking dinner 3 nights a week because you can't afford the refill, $1 isn't a statistic. It's the difference between eating and not eating. Migrant workers are fleeing major cities in numbers not seen since the pandemic. The cost of living didn't gradually rise. It spiked past the ceiling. Rent stays the same. Food costs double. Gas becomes rationed. The math stops working. So people leave. 350 flights were canceled in a single day. The weekly financial hit to Indian carriers alone sits at 875 crore rupees. That's just airlines. Now add the travelers stranded in Dubai, the business deals that collapsed because executives couldn't fly, the weddings postponed, the funerals missed. Airspace over the Middle East is contested. Routes have been rerouted, flight times extended. Costs passed to passengers who already can't afford the increase. This is what a distant war looks like when it reaches your kitchen. But the real catastrophe hasn't started yet. It's building in the soil. India's farmers are already rationing fertilizer they can't afford to replace. Cooking gas is being stretched thinner every week. 9 million workers in the Gulf are watching construction projects shut down around them. The strait that carries half of India's oil just became a shooting gallery where Indian ships get fired on by a country that calls itself India's friend. Pakistan is in the room negotiating ceasefires. India is outside looking in. The port India built to connect itself to Central Asia is being handed back to Iran, and China is waiting to turn it into another link in the chain that's slowly wrapping around India's neck. Strategic autonomy sounded brilliant when conflicts stayed theoretical. The Iran war made it real, and when the shooting started, India discovered that being friends with everyone means you can't call anyone when the house is burning. The fertilizer runs out in weeks. The oil reserves last 3. The question isn't whether India can survive this crisis. The question is what's left of India's foreign policy when the crisis ends, and everyone remembers who stayed silent when it mattered most.